Welcome members of council and members of the directors and members of the gallery and media. My name is John Henderson. Tonight's meeting on Monday, December the 12th is regarding the purpose is to review the Town of Cobourg 2016 Development Charges Background Study as required 5 years, and that's every 5 years, and to provide the opportunity for input from the general public. The current Development Charges Bylaw number 74/2011 will expire on January 1st, 2017. Members of council, are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, I'd like to proceed to Part 4 in your agenda, known as the notification procedure.
Yes, Deputy Mayor. The notices were published in the local newspaper and posted on the municipal website within the required 60-day time frame in accordance with the Development Charges Act and were attached to the agenda.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We're now on Part 5 in the agenda, and Mr. Grunda, Andrew, has been with the Town of Cobourg many years now. I think I've seen him at least for the last 6 years. He's a representative of Watson and Associates, and he was put in charge of the development charges consultant for the Town of Cobourg, and he, as you can see before you, Council, has done a very in-depth study. There's also a summary that's for your perusal. It's in a brown-colored overview if you have a paper copy. And Mr. Gundra, would you like to come up and to the diocese and welcome again?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in front of council again. The purpose of the presentation this evening is a statutory requirement under the Development Charges Act that municipalities, before considering passing a new development charges bylaw, must undertake a statutory public meeting and hear any submissions on the matter before ultimately considering passing that bylaw. And so this is a statutory requirement under the Development Charges Act. As mentioned, notice was given prior to this evening's meeting to notify the public of the meeting itself, and also the DC background document and proposed bylaw were also made available to the public in advance of the meeting so they could review the matter. The background study process that we've undertaken commenced with a number of meetings and discussions with town staff to look at the anticipated growth in development for the municipality over the prescribed periods and the corresponding capital costs related to facilitating that development. Most of the works that are contained in the DC background study are projects that were identified for similar levels of growth in the previous DC background study, with some notable changes which I'll highlight through the presentation. That background study document was released to the public and put on the town's website since November the 3rd. This evening is the public meeting, and the next step in the process will be for council, upon hearing any depositions from the public, consider any changes to the potential proposed fees and policies, and ultimately consider passing the bylaw on January 3rd at council. The illustration that you see in the next slide summarizes the methodology that has to be followed under the Act. And so under the Development Charges Act, because we are looking at a mechanism to recover growth-related costs of capital, we must look at the anticipated development in the municipality over prescribed periods, in that there are some services that are limited to a 10-year forecast period, like parks and recreation, for example. But others, we can look at a broader period. For example, in the study, you'll see water and wastewater services looked at over a build-out forecast, meaning the full development of the available lands. Having identified that anticipated development in the methodology, we must then identify the increase in need for service and do that on a service-specific basis, whether that be, again, for parks or rec or water, sewer, for example. We must measure that increase in need for service relative to the historic level of service that's been provided. So one of the items in the, or the requirements in the Act is that we cannot increase the level of service that's being imposed on new development beyond what had been provided historically on average. And you'll see, with, in particular with respect to parks and recreation, there have been some historic limitations in that respect, but with the recent development of the community center, you've started to see that that increase, that level of investment. We must also identify that there's an expression of council related to those needs, and in large part, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the majority of these projects have been identified previously is a representation of that that need in previous background studies. Having established that, we then must look at the specific capital projects and identify the statutory deductions that may apply. The most notable of those being if there's a benefit to the existing community. So this may result, as an example, if they're doing a road widening project, the fact that you're widening an existing road that would have had to been rehabilitated through its regular life cycle maintenance suggests that we cannot recover fully those costs, but there is a co-funding that's required from the tax base for that replacement activity. Also, it's worth noting that there's a 10% statutory deduction for soft services, so whether it be for library or parks or recreation, those services that are limited to a 10-year forecast period. Once we've determined what that growth-related cost share is, a further 10% deduction is required. And so that results in the underlying capital costs, or the growth-related capital costs as they're commonly referred to, which then divided by the anticipated development provides us with a schedule of charges. And so when we step through that illustration, again, more detail being provided in the DC background study, you'll see that the growth forecast has been prepared. It's been prepared consistent with the 2014 Northumberland Housing Forecast Study and the respective growth for the town therein. It looks at the statutory 10-year period to 2027 for those services that cannot exceed that period of time. We've also looked at a broader 20-year forecast period and a build-out of the lands defined within the existing urban service area and that in the Cobourg East community. And so that is worth noting in that in prior DC bylaws, the municipality sought to recover costs for water and wastewater on what's deemed to be an area-specific basis. So having the development in the Cobourg East community pay for their hard infrastructure of water, sewer, and storm, and development in the existing urban service area being outside of Cobourg East paying for their respective costs. And so that's why you see those areas identified specifically. When we look at the anticipated development, again, in that underlying housing forecast, it's expected that development would occur at a rate of about 157 units a year over the 10-year forecast period, and about 68 of those occurring in the Cobourg East serviced area. So as we start to progress forward, seeing greater development occurring there than anticipated historically. Also, with respect to non-residential development, this is development for commercial, institutional, and industrial development. It's expected that growth annually would be approximately 37,000 square feet of gross floor area constructed, again with about 28% of that expected to occur in the Cobourg East community. So you'll see in Appendix A of the DC background study in further detail the details of that forecast, whereby the municipality as a whole would grow from a current population of just under 20,000 to a build-up population of 37,540 with the full development of the Cobourg East lands in the existing urban serviced area, and that would be facilitated with the development of approximately 17,000 additional residential dwelling units. Over that same period, what's expected is that employment growth would be about 17,000 additional jobs in the municipality, that growth would be to 17,000 additional employment in that regard, and that would result in an increase of about 1,300 additional employees in the municipality. So just to summarize, over the 20-year forecast period, we have residential growth of about 3,400 units, or an increase in population of 6,100, 6,200. Non-residential growth of about 1,300 employees, requiring the construction of about 1 million square feet of gross floor area and space. So having identified that anticipated development, the next step in that process is to look at the increase in needs on a service-by-service basis. You see summarized on this first slide is the services that are contained over the 10-year forecast period, including transit, municipal parking facilities, parks and recreation services, library, studies or administrative services, and marina services. And based on our review of the previous background studies and master planning work that have been done since, fill out the requirements of those capital needs, and you see those in detail in the background study, particularly in Chapter 5 thereof. Similarly, when we looked at the build-out forecast period, we've looked at those harder services over that broader period to recognize the average cost over multiple generations. And those would include transportation services for roads, for public works, fire protection, and police protection services as well over that time frame. And then lastly, when we look at the area-specific charges, so these charges that would only be imposed in those communities, as I mentioned earlier, the water, wastewater services, and storm that are required for regional systems in Cobourg East have been identified on that area-specific basis. So the total capital program that you see identified in the background study, again, over those respective periods, would total about $241 million. Of those costs, as you can see illustrated in this pie chart, about 68% of them would be DC recoverable and have been included in the calculation of the development charges in the background study. The next largest share that you see on the right-hand side of about $55 million is what is the benefit to existing development deduction that I mentioned earlier. That's recognizing the benefit related to those capital costs that accrue to existing constituents that would be paid for through traditional mechanisms of user fees and taxation. And then there are other deductions that are also provided for grants, subsidies, and other contributions towards new development, and the 10% statutory deduction for soft services. I would also highlight there's two other components that are worth noting. Of that $24 million, there's approximately $11 million, which is deemed to be a post-period benefit. So this is acknowledging that some of the capital projects that you see, particularly those in soft services, are going to have benefits beyond their 10-year forecast period. And so those costs, while growth-related, cannot be included in the calculation at this time, but can be considered in future years. Similarly, the illustration also shows that about $5.7 million of that $241 million has already been collected through previous DCs and are in a reserve fund currently to be provided for those needs. And so we are not looking to recover or to double recover, more correctly, for those costs. And when we break down the growth-related needs that are in the DC background study of $164 million, what this pie chart illustrates is the services that are generating those needs. And not atypical or quite common is that the majority of those costs are for hard costs of infrastructure in transportation, water, wastewater, and storm. Those services collectively represent about 88% of the overall capital costs underlying the charge. The remaining 12% would be for all of the other soft services. The next slide summarizes the calculated schedule of development charges. What you'll note from the schedule of development charges is that there are the first section of services, which are deemed to be municipal-wide services, that meaning that they're imposed on a uniform basis, whether or not that development occurs within the existing urban serviced area or Cobourg East. The charges below that are the area-specific charges for water and wastewater and storm, respectively, in the existing urban serviced area and Cobourg area East. You'll also note that the charges for residential are broken down by dwelling unit type, and the change in that charge by dwelling unit type is reflective of the underlying occupancy related to those units. So for example, a single family home typically exhibits a higher occupancy than a bachelor apartment unit would, and therefore the charges are lower for the bachelor apartment unit accordingly. If we look at a single detached residential unit, you can see at the bottom of the table the charge that is being proposed for the existing urban service area would be $17,594 per unit, and in the Cobourg East community, $26,011 per unit. Similarly, on the far right-hand side, the charges that would be imposed for non-residential, that being commercial, industrial, and institutional, the maximum charge that could be imposed would be $5.47 a square foot in the existing urban service area, and $8.87 per square feet in the Cobourg East community. To provide some context for those proposed charges, we've included a comparison of the current charges to those calculated rates. The next slide summarizes those for a single detached residential unit on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side for a non-residential constructed square foot of gross floor area. When we look at the municipal-wide service charges, what you see is that those are the services that are increasing the most significantly for residential, from $10,223 to $16,412. And what those are driven by is the basically the additional need required for grade separation for the Wilmot Street extension for roads, and for the additional fitness and aquatic facilities related to Parks and Rec services. As you'll see, the Parks and Rec services number is up quite considerably compared to the existing charge. In part, that's related to the increase in investment that the town has made, which has increased your level of service over the last 10 years. It's also worth noting that the charge for transit is not identified to be carried forward. That's reflective of the fact that the recent transit study that was prepared had identified the need for an additional bus with an additional route, and that had significant or sufficient funding had been secured through the last bylaw to cover those costs, and so no further collection was required to meet with that anticipated need. When we look at the charges in the existing urban service area and the Cobourg East, we see a slight shift occurring from the existing to the Cobourg East, reflective of the engineering requirements for capacity being shifted for development in the Cobourg East community development area. And we see at the bottom again that the charge in the existing urban service area of $17,594 would be an increase from a current charge per unit of $11,798. And in Cobourg East, the charge would go from currently around $18,816 to $26,011. In terms of non-residential, again, what we see is that the non-residential charge in the existing urban service area would stay relatively constant, increasing slightly from $5.45 a square foot to $5.47, and a decrease in the charge in the Cobourg East community for non-residential from $9.15 to $8.87. And the reason for those changes is a change in the respective population to employment relationship for the remainder of the forecast periods. To put those impacts in a broader context, what we've then done is provided you with a comparison for different residential dwelling unit types and non-residential development. The first table that you see is a survey of development charges in respective municipalities, including not just the lower tier development charges, but also including upper tier charges where those are applicable, and also Board of Education municipal development or Board of Education development charges that could be imposed as well. With the proposed charges, you can see at the top end of the comparators, the Durham region municipalities would be the highest charges, representing charges between $40,000 to $45,000 per unit, and that those would compare with the proposed charges, including the county, just over $25,000 per unit in the Cobourg East community, and to a lesser extent in the urban serviced area at just over $15,000 per unit. When we look at residential charges for apartments, however, what we see is that while the relative competitive position was relatively maintained for single-family homes, those charges are much more pronounced for apartments if we look at a two-bedroom apartment, for example. The reason for that is updating the DC background study for recent census data shows a greater occupancy being exhibited in the occupancy per unit of apartment units this time versus the study 5 years ago, which again, recognizing the charges are on a per capita basis, a greater occupancy is showing a greater charge in that respect. Still, the charges being proposed being less than that in Durham when we compare it to Coburg East community, and for the existing urban serviced area comparable to that in Port Hope and Peterborough and Kawartha Lakes. When we look at commercial development, again, with the modest increase that is being identified in the existing urban serviced area, the municipality would keep its same relative position, comparable with that with Belleville and Brighton. In the Coburg East community area, the proposed charge is slightly decreasing from its current position, less than that in Trent Hills, in Durham Region, and higher than that in Peterborough. And then lastly, we've also included a comparison for industrial development. And when we look at industrial development, what you'll note is that the town's policy currently is not to impose development charges in the existing urban serviced area, and only to impose development charges on industrial development to the extent that that occurs in the Coburg East community. And so again, we see the same sort of relative position of the proposed charges in the Coburg East community, and what's currently being provided is that the exemption in the existing urban service area would be maintained for council's consideration. So that summarizes the calculation of the charge and its comparisons. In terms of the policies that would govern the bylaw, they're largely unchanged from your current practice, whereby the charges would be imposed on a uniform municipal-wide basis for all services other than water, sewer, and storm, and that water, sewer, and storm charges would be imposed on an area-specific basis consistent with your current policy in Coburg East in the existing urban serviced area. That these would be facilitated through the passage of one bylaw, and that all of the charges would be payable at the time of building permit issuance. That being said, council does have the authority to enter into agreement with developers to either accelerate or defer those payments, but that has to be done through agreement. In terms of exemptions, so these are developments that council has acknowledged development charges would not be payable on. We've maintained these existing policies. Council can reduce, contract, eliminate, or expand these as council deems fit. But what is important to note is that to the extent that council does exempt development from payment of development charges, then that's revenue foregone through development charges that would have to be made up from another source. And so currently the non-statutory exemptions that you have in your bylaw is that you do not impose development charges on small commercial developments if they're less than 4,000 square feet or equal to 4,000 square feet or less, more appropriately. And as I mentioned earlier, you do not impose development charges on industrial development if that development occurs within the boundaries of the existing urban serviced area. We'd also note that there are redevelopment credits that are witnessed for development charges. So this is just reflecting that some development may be replacing what is currently there. And to the extent that that occurs, the town's bylaw would recognize a credit against development charge payments for a period of 5 years. So a simple illustration of that being if there was a single family home that was to catch fire and have to be demolished and replaced, when they came forward for their building permit, a DC would be calculated, but there would be an offsetting credit, so no DC would be paid for the replacement of that single family home. However, if it was replaced with a 6-unit townhouse, for example, that developer would have to pay for the increment over and above the credit for the one single family home being replaced. And then lastly, the policy is that the charges you see before you are currently in $2016, and that those would be indexed annually on January 1st of each year to make sure that the underlying funding for the projects keeps pace with capital cost inflation over the 5-year bylaw term. So that concludes my presentation. In terms of next steps, again, is for council to hear any comments from the public on the matter and to give consideration to those items and whether they warrant any amendment to the proposal that's presented today. Through that process, council will be required to determine if those amendments, if any are required, would require a subsequent public meeting on the matter. And then also, as noted in the introduction, the matter would then come forward to council for passage or consideration of passage on January 3rd council meeting. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. If I could just have you remain for a moment. Are there any questions of clarity from members of council? Mayor Brockeneer.
Yes, thank you, Chair Henderson. So, Andrew, I've got a couple of questions. So when I look at your DC comparison charts in all categories, so when I look at what I call Durham and West, and then you go east of Durham, there's a dramatic difference in upper and lower tier amounts. Is that because of the regional government in Durham and Durham West?
Not particularly. It is in part related to that, in that you see the regional charges are quite significant in those municipalities as compared to the county charges that are posed in Northumberland. But again, they are referencing some similar services, maybe not all of the services that are imposed at a regional level, such as water and sewer, which tend to make up the most significant components, as they do here.
Any questions from other members of council? Council McCarthy, and then back to Mayor Brockeneer.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just wondered if I could have an explanation. I understand a little better of the underfunding of the library services. Does this mean that money that could have been put aside in a reserve fund wasn't?
Sorry,
Andrew, thank you for that. Respond.
I'm on page 4-11. The library services is negative 18,883 for the reserve fund balances. And I only ask that because I'm on the library board.
Okay. So let me just...
Well, the explanation that's given in the text is that it reflects underfunding for eligible projects or costs. So I just really wasn't sure what that meant.
No, so what this is, I think, referring to is just that the amount collected previously compared to the amount that had been spent is placing that in a deficit, and so we need to continue to recover for that and bring that into this calculation.
Mayor Brockeneer.
Thanks again, Chair Henderson. So, Andrew, on page 16, when you talk about timing and deferral agreements, the very last point on that page, the town has the ability to enter into deferral or accelerated payment agreements. So it seems that I've been able to find a few municipalities across Ontario now that are entering into deferred payments, trying to encourage residential development, multi-residential development, in fact. So could you comment on that, please?
Sure. Yeah, and so we've heard of that, particularly with respect to high density, and looking for the imposition of those charges at a time later than building permit issuance. And with respect to high density, the rationale being that typically what's required is that the development charges are paid at the time the first building permit is issued, which typically would be the foundation permit for a high density unit, and that there's a great period of time between the actual construction of all of the high density units and its ultimate occupancy as compared to a single family home, where there's not as significant as a significant amount of a lag that you would see. And so what some municipalities would do to help with the cash flow related to that development is to enter into an agreement with that applicant to have their charges payable at a later point in time, so maybe at the time of occupancy, as an example. The thing to be aware of when you're looking at deferred payment agreements is to make sure that you have protections in place in those agreements, so that if there does happen to be a default, for example, that's not being passed on to the homeowner, but that would reside with the builder itself.
Any other questions, members of council? Councillor Darling?
Yes, thank you. Through you to the speaker. Just again, as having a background in the fire service, and we've talked about it years ago about having a second hall. I'm on page 516, and you've put in here additional facility space, 14,000. Are you recommending a second hall when in the East End, when the Coburg development progresses to that extent in those years?
Through you, Chair, you'll see in the previous DC background study identification for more specific locations of fire hall. Through our discussions with staff and the needs, it felt that there would still be a demand for additional space, but at this point, premature to determine specifically where that might be. That might be optimized through centralized locations or otherwise. So this is still maintaining that need that was identified previously, but just not specifying specifically at this point in time, allowing the planning to occur through council as to when and where that would occur.
Very good, thank you.
Any other questions, members of council? Just to share with council one question I asked earlier that was answered, and Andrew already made reference to it. When he spoke about transit and that we do have the proper available funds, I just want to be clear that's based on the IBI transit study that was done that made certain recommendations. So if council did choose in time to go in that direction, we would have that latitude to do so, but we could not go beyond their recommendations based on this study. So just to be clear on that point. Hearing none, thank you very much, Andrew, for a very in-depth presentation. If we now go to our agenda, we are in part number 5 under public submissions. And are there any public submissions in support of this presentation? Hearing none, are there any public submissions in opposition? Okay, there appear to be a number. So, Joseph, I think I saw your hand first, so please come to the diocese, and for the clerk, if you could state your full name and your address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Joseph Gare. I'm a resident of the City of Toronto, but I own the Palisade Gardens retirement residence here in Coburg, and also several other pieces of land. I just wanted to address the study, and just want to say that my comments are contextualized in the understanding that DCs are required in order to offset the costs that are being incurred by municipality in order for it to expand. However, I'm addressing a subsegment of which wasn't really spoken of, I don't think. We're looking to develop some modest-priced rental housing, not subsidized, but modest priced. Not waterfront looking, but addressing the majority of the needs of renters in this town. CMHC has identified the fact that there's a vacancy rate here that is less than 1% in that segment. And in looking at their information, the rental rates are quite low. They're around the $2 a foot range. DC charges are a deterrent. An increase in DC charges are a deterrent to the development of this kind of housing, because the capital costs make it uneconomical to produce rental housing for this marketplace. We studied it independently within our own operation and found that we were surprised that it at the results. So we hired an outside consultant to check our studies, and it was confirmed to us that given current development costs, it's almost impossible to build rental housing in this town that's not waterfront facing and that aims at the majority of the population requiring rental housing. I just want to make that point because all I saw here were basically references to generalized housing, apartment housing, and I think that I'm addressing a specific segment of that.
Okay, are there any questions, members of council, for clarity? Councillor McCarthy?
Thank you. Through you to Mr. Gare. They broke it down into low density, medium, and high, and the high was exclusively apartments. Are you suggesting single-family dwellings or townhouse dwellings that you build to rent? I'm just not sure what kind of properties you're thinking of.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. No, I'm talking about apartment buildings, multi-residential, which was addressed here.
Any other questions, members of council? Hearing none, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I believe there was another gentleman. If you'd like to come up, diocese, and again state your name and address for the clerk and the record.
My name is Craig Ferguson. My residence is in Toronto, Ontario. Good evening, members of council. I want to thank you for allowing me to speak at this public meeting on development charges in Cobourg. I'm with the firm Urban Metrics. We're a real estate consulting firm located in Toronto. Part of our work includes a review of development charge background studies on behalf of the development community. I'm here this evening because I've been retained by 14 estates, who are Sean and Rick Rondo, to review the 2016 Cobourg development charge background study. As you may know, the Rondos currently have draft plan approval for approximately 1,700 units located in the Cobourg East secondary plan. The Rondos are currently in the process of working with the town to prepare a new draft plan for their property. As currently proposed, the number of units in this draft plan would range between 1,600 and 2,000 units at full build-out. The number of units proposed by the Rondo could account for as much as 25% of building activity in Cobourg, and the significant number of units proposed by the Rondos make them the largest residential developer in the town. Therefore, they have a vested interest in ensuring the development charges are calculated using a fair and reasonable methodology. While the Rondos are concerned with the proposed town-wide development charge, which is proposed to increase by approximately 16%, their most significant concern is related to the area-specific development charge proposed in the Cobourg East secondary plan. As proposed, the development charge in Cobourg East will be nearly 50% higher than other areas of Cobourg. These high development charges have created a significant disincentive for development in Cobourg East. As you know, the Cobourg East secondary plan was adopted by Cobourg Council in 2005, and although it has been placed for nearly 12 years, there is yet to be a single unit developed in this area of the town. The reason for this lack of development is a high development charges relative to the rest of Cobourg. Developers in Cobourg have chosen to locate their developments in other areas of the town where the development charges are lower. So with areas of Cobourg approaching build-out, it is possible that in the future developers may leapfrog Cobourg and instead go to municipalities like Port Hope or Hamilton or Brighton, where development charges are significantly lower than Cobourg East. So in ensuring that development charges in Cobourg East are competitive with the rest of the Cobourg and neighboring municipalities will help spur development in this area of the town. This will help create jobs in the town through construction jobs. It'll provide an ongoing benefit to the town in terms of ongoing property tax revenue, and it'll increase spending at local businesses through higher population growth. So Cobourg is recognized as one of the best places to live in Canada. So in addition to the charm and community feel of Cobourg, a major reason people move to the town is its relative affordability in comparison to Durham region. So by increasing development charges as significantly as proposed, it could result in higher housing prices, which could deter some people from moving to Cobourg. So the development proposed by the Rondos in Cobourg East will also provide a significant public benefit to people in Cobourg. Their draft plan includes 33 hectares of parks, open space, and woodlots, which represent 31% of the land area of their total development. And these parks and this open space can be used by residents all across Cobourg. So overall, 14 estates and the Rondos are asking the town to take a look at the development charge background study for Cobourg East and identify ways to bring them in line with the rest of Cobourg. So right now, I'm in the process of reviewing the development charge background study, and in the coming days I will be submitting a letter to the town identifying any questions and concerns we may have. And at that time, we look forward to sitting down with town staff and its consultants to review these questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, if you can just remain in case there are questions of clarity from members of council. Any questions of clarity from members of council? Seeing, yes, we will. Seeing none, if I could just ask one question. I caught some of the names. I know you highlighted a few names where you felt development charges were in a more reasonable line. Could I ask you just to repeat those community names for me once more?
So, I mean, this is similar to the slide that was up before where Port Hope, Hamilton, Brighton all have development charges that are significantly less than the Cobourg East specifically. And then also, if you looked at that chart, there were a number of municipalities that were higher, but all those were located in Durham region. So in terms of people moving from Durham region, retirees looking to downsize and find a more affordable home, it's possible that based on price point, these people, developers may choose to go to Port Hope or these other municipalities where it's possible that they can get that price point for new residents.
Okay, and again, at some point, we appreciate receiving your notes based on that, and we look forward to your forthcoming letter as well.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the gallery? Al, please come up to the diocese, and again, if you can state your name and address, thank you.
Mr. Chair, Your Worship, my name is Al LeBlanc. I'm a developer in Cobourg here. First of all, I want to say that I think the development charges that are charged right now are fair and equitable. My issue is that, when you look at the numbers, it looks like it's, approximately around 40% increase. And my question would be, this is an ongoing process, and we did this 5 years ago, and I don't know who did the study 5 years ago, but when they did that study, what was that study, did they make errors in assumptions or whatever? Because, we can live with like a cost of living increase and things like that, but a 40% increase is quite drastic. And when this report was done 5 years ago, were there errors in that report? Secondly, that it appears that the development charges that are being charged now are generating I would say, a lucrative reserve. The reserve right now is like over $5 million. When the study was done 5 years ago, what was the projection of that reserve? And are the assumptions made in this study too high? So they would be my questions.
And just to ask Mr. Franklin, I see you writing furiously. Did you get those points down?
I'm trying to accommodate as much as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, based on that, for Mr. LeBlanc, are there any questions of clarity? Seeing none, are there any other members of the gallery? Max, okay, you can choose who comes up. Thank you again. Once again, if you can state name and address.
I'm Christopher Langley, representative of Van Dyke Development Group, part of the Van Dyke Group of Companies, resident of Markham, Ontario, actually. One of the reasons why Van Dyke has enjoyed working with the town of Cobourg over the last 10 years now is one of two reasons. The first reason is that town of Cobourg, compared to a lot of other smaller towns within general neighborhood around this area, as well as other places that we do business with and all over Ontario, is very much open to business. We really very much enjoyed the working relationship that we've had with the town of Cobourg over the last 2 years, mainly from a price point of development charges standpoint, and mainly from the relationships that we've had with town staff as well as town council. Over the course of us receiving draft plan approval for our final phase, which is the Phase 5 lands up north where Canadian Tire is in 2014, until time of when we went on for sale about last year, to now, we're looking at what Al LeBlanc said is about a 40 to 50% increase in development charges. We are now sold out within this phase and looking forward to get moving on with construction and building costs. One of the concerns that we have moving forward with this is the corporate decision of whether or not to pass this development charge on to our purchasers or to absorb it as a cost of ourselves, mainly being that it wasn't generally calculated within our pro formas that there would be such a great increase, because over the last course of 5 years it's only been nominal, few percents here and there. One thing that I'd like to pose as a question is whether or not a prepayment program could actually occur earlier than the building permit process, whether or not draft plan approval could be sufficient enough in order to prepay from a DC level, or if there's any certain milestones that can be achieved along the way in certain circumstances to allow for this. That's my only comment. No really other questions other than that, and I appreciate the presentation that Andrew and Watson has done over the course of the night, so thank you very much.
If you can just remain, is there any questions of clarity from members of council? Andrew, would it be appropriate for you to address that one question, or at this point, or can you, about in particular, can it be done earlier than the permit?
Sure. So yeah, in response to that question, as was mentioned, while the council has the ability to enter into deferred payment agreements, you also have the ability to enter into accelerated payment agreements as well. So if council elected to enter into agreement to have those prepaid, that's well within your authority to do that.
And just for my question, would that be just a part of the bylaw, or would it have to be a special amendment to the bylaw?
So through you, so it's not something you would specifically address in the bylaw, but that you would address under agreement. So you could, the powers that you do have under the Act. So currently, your practice, which is fairly typical, is to recover all of your development charges at the time of building permit issuance. Under the Act, you can recover hard services, so typically that for roads, water, sewer, at the time of subdivision registration, if you chose to do so. That typically isn't well received by the development community, because it requires them to pay a significant amount of those development charges earlier than when they're closer to occupancy, and that's typically why most people would do it at building permit. That being said, while you could in place those policies in your bylaw, but you could maintain your current practice of imposing the building permit, but then enter into separate agreements on a case-by-case basis to have somebody prepay or defer payment at a later time. So you have that authority to do that.
Okay, thank you for that. I believe there are still members of the gallery, and Max, I know you're familiar with our council, so again, please come on up and state your full name and your address.
My name is Max Lamarchaw, 940 Hornell Park Drive, and I represent New Amherst Homes. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak here. My concerns and questions basically consistent with the other people that have spoke, really three areas. First of all, I think the cost increase is significant. It's 40%. It's a big jump, and that's that's a lot of money going forward. And I think if there's any encouragement for that to be looked at carefully, as Al LeBlanc has suggested, and just to make sure that it is as economical and as well planned as possible, I would encourage that as well. I know there's a lot of thought that goes into these things, but it is a 40% jump. That's a huge amount of money going forward for us. The second point I wanted to bring forward was in line with Chris from Van Dyke's point, is that with the increase in development charges, we're not really prepared for that in our agreements that we've written going forward for a reasonable period of time in the future. In other words, contracts that we've made to deliver homes, even though we may have the provision to increase development charges after in between now when we close the home, it's not it's not going to be well received by the purchasers moving to town or moving into their new home and getting whacked with this surprise. And I was wondering, given that, if you can give us a little bit of, would consider giving the development community a little bit of a leeway or heads up in the nature of what I would ask for would be at least a year, that these development charges do not go up for a year, and that would give, I think, reasonable amount of time for us to move forward with our agreements. And so that's my second point. My third point is that I think with respect to fairness, and I think that development charges are a burden for everybody. They're a big cost, and I think that given that, all people do benefit from the development charges expenditures. People use parks, people use transit, sewer, and so forth. And I think that it's important that development charges are dealt with fairly across the board, and that it's a level playing field for the development community, and that they're not separate deals that are made that, you know, somebody gets a break because they're renting, with all due respect, to a lower at a lower price point. If there's a lower price point and they need a subsidy, I think that should be applied to on that basis, because otherwise it confuses the development charges and other people get left carrying the burden. And I know there's been instances of that, not just with, there's always an argument why somebody shouldn't pay development charges. It's because of this, or it's because of that, or it's because of some benefit they're bringing. We'd all like to pay less charges. But if we're going to pay charges, I would ask that it just be fair across the board. And as far as, subsidies, I know that everybody in this community works hard to try and support people that need help, special initiatives in other ways. And so I would just ask that that be kept clean if it can be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, members of council, for clarity? Councillor Rowden?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And this would be for Andrew. I think that has this been known to happen in other areas before, that when the development charges come forward to go into a bylaw, that there can be an exemption for 1 year for developers to make sure that they're aware of what the price is going up in case there's stuff that's been pre-sold?
I believe that the town of Cobourg has done it before for us, which we very much appreciated. A number of years ago, I think it was probably a couple of cycles ago. I just had one other comment that I missed. May I make that?
By all means, that's why you're here.
With respect to Development Area C, the other thing that I'd note is that the reason that development charges in C are more expensive is because there's been more costs that have been expended in that area to develop that area. So, again, with respect to fairness, I think that that's important to remember, with all due respect to the Rondo Group. It's not that they're paying higher costs. You're paying too much along with the rest of us, but there's a reason for that. It's not just to penalize Area C. As far as I understand from being here for however long we've been here, I just wanted to point that out as well.
Okay, thank you. And Andrew, do you have a comment to Councillor Rowden?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So the municipality does have the ability to either phase in the charges, so that the charges that are being proposed can be phased in over a period of time. What's also a practice that you may see in municipalities that are having a significant increase is to recognize grandfathering of charges as well, where you could establish a time frame of, because these are payable at the time of issuance of building permit, for anybody who has submitted building permits but have not yet had them issued, the charges could be maintained at current rates, or even moving back from that if it was related to somebody further along in the development process who was draft approved, for example, or registered more appropriately but not yet built. You could look to grandfather those applications at current rates as well, or a more modest increase. So those are all potential options as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions at this point? Are there any other members of the gallery who wish to come forward? By all means, I'll allow you that latitude because, again, that's why you're here. So,
Yeah,
Joseph, welcome.
Appreciate it. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. The reason that my group is looking to create rental housing in the town is because it is a stated objective of the town and the county that new and additional rental housing be built. I also want to make it clear that I wasn't suggesting that development charges ought not to be charged, because I support them as well. But I do think that I would appreciate it if it would be considered that these be geared toward meeting these objectives of the town in one way or another, either by delaying them or by gearing them toward meeting these objectives in one way or another, and I don't have the answer for that. Okay? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your additional comments. Are there any other members of the gallery? Are there any other comments from members of council? And Andrew, I have one if you don't mind. And I do appreciate you responding to this if you can. Bill 7 indicated it's a promotion regarding the Affordable Housing Act. In understanding from the province, it's received third reading. And the intent of this act is to allow municipalities or council to implement an inclusionary zone bylaw to require new development to contain a certain number of affordable housing units. And I just don't know, because I know it's third reading, which is not final or royal assent. And I just don't know if, are you able to speak to that at this point?
Through you, not particularly the reference of that bill, but just on the point of affordable housing, there are examples of municipalities that would have non-statutory exemption policies in their bylaw for affordable housing units. And typically the way that would work is that a municipality would impose the DC at the time of building permit issuance, and then once it can be substantiated that those have been either sold or rented based on affordable housing definitions, those funds could be rebated. So there are examples of that. From a policy perspective, if council wanted to incentivize those, to have those types of non-statutory exemptions in your bylaw.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions, members of council? Hearing none, I see a few hands. Sorry, Councillor McCarthy, was your hand up? Oh, Councillor Darling?
Yes, I'm kind of curious. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to ask this, but one of the questions from the gentleman was, what was the projection of the reserve 5 years ago? Are we able to get that, or do we have to wait until staff can come up with that number?
Mr. Franklin or Mr. Davey, do you want to respond, or Mr. Franklin?
I don't have that before me at this point. I'd have to get back to council.
Okay, I kind of thought so, but I thought seeing the question come up, maybe if we could answer it. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Franklin, I know you've been scribing extensively. Do you have any questions at all that you would like clarity on?
Not at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Davey, I saw you scribing in your own method as well. Do you have any further questions? Okay, hearing none, I'd like to go back to the agenda. Again, are there any written comments, submissions received by the clerk as the date of printing of the agenda?
Deputy Mayor, there were none received by the clerk.
Okay, that ends tonight's public meeting. I call for adjournment.